Omar, I think you are muted.
How about now? Hi, good evening to everyone in Palestine, and welcome to this panel on militarized digital spaces. My name is Omar Baddar, and we have an absolutely terrific panel today. There's a lot of activism that is dedicated to the political and diplomatic and legal spheres, but one of the most consequential spheres of influence of the Israeli occupation is the tech and digital space, which Israel has built an entire industry around, an industry of international surveillance and espionage, where it experiments on Palestinians and then it sells these tools of oppression worldwide. And today's panel is an exceptional one in helping us get a deeper understanding of this sphere. We have joining us is Mona Shtaya, an advocacy and communications expert working in the MENA region. She is currently the advocacy and communications manager at Hamle, and of course, one of the hardest working people because she's preparing for this talk and helping put this entire event together. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute in the Cybersecurity and Emerging Technology program and the Palestine-Israel program as well. We are also joined by Sausan Abu Eid. She is an associate for the Arms Division at Human Rights Watch, where she works to advance humanitarian disarmament and enhance protections for civilians from various weapons that inflict unnecessary and indiscriminate harm, including autonomous weapon systems, which is part of what we're here to talk about as well. Her interests include exploring the development and use of these weapon systems within the Palestinian context. And last but not least, we're also joined by Dr. Fabio Cristiano, an assistant professor in conflict studies at Utrecht University. Tell me if I said that right, hopefully close enough. He is a critical security scholar whose research explores the making of conflict and security in and through cyberspace. He also published widely on cybersecurity, surveillance, algorithms, and digital rights in Palestine and beyond. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining this panel today. I guess we can start with Muna. If you can just give us a sense a little bit in kind of introducing this topic about what militarized surveillance looks like in Palestine and how it impacts the lives of Palestinians on the ground.
Hi, Omar. Hi, everybody. I'm really glad to join you here today to speak about our militarized spaces. And like I'm speaking now from Palestine, a very militarized space, the physical world as well as our online spaces. So that's pretty much intense. But let me start with talking about surveillance in Palestine in general and give an overview about what does like surveillance in Palestine, how does like or how do surveillance in Palestine looks like. So if we just look at Palestine, we can see that there is Palestinians who are living under a state of surveillance. Keeping in mind when we are talking about that, the power asymmetry between the Israelis as occupiers and the Palestinians as occupied people, and those who are the occupiers are basically getting benefits out of this occupation, military occupation, and ongoing systematic discrimination against Palestinians by building and developing, as well as testing their surveillance technologies on Palestinians before selling that worldwide to profit from the military occupation. And when we are speaking about surveillance, we can give examples, but we can't like mention all the surveillance technologies that we are exposed to in Palestine, because whenever we are talking about surveillance, we can mention like facial recognition, CCTV cameras, drones, blue wolf, white wolf, red wolf. We can also talk about the online surveillance for our digital spaces, and I'm gonna now like walk through those and give like a brief about each one of them. We can't also ignore the whole industry of spywares and malwares, where Israel is also developing spyware such as Pegasus, owned by NSO company, which is basically used worldwide, and their only customers are the governments, and most probably they are the oppressive governments around the world. And that's how such oppressive regimes and colonizers are exporting repression and are profiting from military occupation. Just like to give some thoughts about one of those militarization tools that they are using. when like I want to start with an example. In 2021, the first, like when anyone just talk about May uprising and May 2021, first image that is coming into my mind is the Palestinians in Jerusalem when they were trying to break the cameras, the CCTV cameras in the streets of Jerusalem, basically in East Jerusalem, because they thought that those cameras are basically used to militarize their physical, like their real life spaces, where they are basically arrested, interrogated, and sentenced based on their peaceful protests in the streets. That's one thing, but that's not the only thing. Just to give you also an example, we have conducted an ethnographic report a couple of years ago, and one of the women in East Jerusalem, she said that she's a Muslim woman, and of course she's putting hijab on her head. She said that she's putting hijab inside their home, which is supposed to be her safe space, because she doesn't feel safe inside her home because the CCTV camera is invading her home. Same is happening in the military checkpoints in Hebron, where they also developed their the so-called smart city, which is basically a model of automated occupation, where they have smart gun, the automated gun, where they also have the CCTV cameras, the facial recognition, and they also started there to develop their Blue Wolf, which is basically a huge database where they are profiling Palestinians, entering our databases to a bigger data servers called Wolfpack, where they are saving our data, and whenever a Palestinian is going to pass through checkpoint, this database basically is used to show how or if this Palestinian is a security threat for Israelis. And again, when we say security threat, like the definition of a security threat for them is not very clear. It sometimes can deny you your right to get a permit for medical aids in Jerusalem just because one of your cousins or one of your relatives is a prisoner or is a martyr or something like that. So the term militarizing of our spaces, of our digital spaces, is really broad term, and it has so many subtopics that is coming under that. But like that's just a brief to start the conversation and to warm up. But also, if we just look at the online spaces, where the Israeli military spokesperson are also trying to collect data from Palestinians, especially through those captains pages on Facebook. Sometimes they are spreading misinformation or disinformation for certain area, and they are calling on people to send them some information about certain people like that. They are doing that publicly, and sometimes they would even tell people, if you are getting us something like that, we are able to get you a permit to enter Israel. So that's such like some of the ways that they are using to militarize our online spaces as well as our urban places where we are living under the panopticon effect that is basically affecting our trust relationships, our daily life, as well as our behavior, because like whenever we feel that we are watched all the time, we are going to behave at our best. And again, at our best means that we are changing our behavior just because we feel like watched.
Thank you, Muna. It really is remarkable. I think Palestinians are among perhaps the single most surveilled people on the planet. It's kind of reminiscent of 1984 a little bit, and one can only imagine the psychological impact of feeling like you're under watch constantly as well. Just a reminder for the people watching that if you have any questions that you would like to ask, please drop them in the chat. And after a couple of rounds of speaking with our speakers, we're going to get around to these questions as well. Maybe next I can ask Fabio a little bit about your work, about the militarization of cyberspace, kind of globally beyond Palestine as well, and specifically the role that Israel plays in it, because I know that it is a pretty significant role. Can you kind of describe what that scene is like on a global level?
Yes, thank you, Omar, and thank you, Hamle, for organizing this and having me. It's been a great pleasure to listen to the previous speakers, and I look forward to listen to the speakers in the next days. So following up on Mona's very comprehensive intro, I want to zoom out a bit and maybe start with a quote to situate a bit my contribution. So in 1996, the cyber utopianist John Barlow, that you might know as the founder of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, wrote something called the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace, which said, addressing the governments of the industrial world, and I quote, "I come from cyberspace, the new home of mind. On behalf of the future, I ask you of the past to leave us alone. You are not welcome among us. You have no sovereignty where we gather." And I think unfortunately, this future wished for by these early cyber utopianists, unfortunately, did not materialize today. And so we should be very much skeptical about the techno-optimistic perspectives that we are often presented with. Today, in fact, we see that the militarization of cyberspace is a well-known fact, and it's not covert as in the past. And it also relates on how sovereignty plays out in this context. So I want to say something very quickly about these two aspects to also kind of, contextualize then my contribution about Palestine. So when we think about militarization, we see that in 2016, that is 20 years after the Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace, NATO declared cyberspace to be an official domain of military operations. So very much along the lines of air, land, and sea. And so we have to be aware of the fact that this is the context that we are talking about, right? This is officially considered to be a battlefield. And in fact, military engagement in cyberspace has been originally and historically covert, but today we see that there is a growing trend to openly acknowledge military cyber forces. So 30 states are today known to have developed official cyber commands. And so states increasingly acknowledge also the fact that offensive cyber operations are part of their military strategy. So they use them as legitimate instruments of international relations. So this is the context when it comes, we are talking about when we discuss the militarization of cyberspace. Another trend which is important to mention is that we see today an acceleration towards fragmentation of the technical layer of the internet. So whereas cyber utopianists thought about the internet as this space free of sovereignty, we see increasingly that this is a space which is fragmented at the technical layer. And so, for instance, we can think about originally this process being, championed by authoritarian regimes. So Russia with the RUNET project, or China with the Great Firewall. But today, the national segmentation of the internet at the technical layer, it's something that is entering also the debate of the so-called like-minded states and progressive countries, with the EU, for instance, talking a lot about digital sovereignty. So in this context, it is important to think about the role of Israel vis-a-vis these two trends. And there is studies, of course, showing that Israel is one of the leading cyber power in the world, with actually not only in terms of the military capabilities, offensive capabilities, but also in terms of the commercial position that Israel has in relation to the commercialization of cybersecurity products. We are talking about 7% of the global market of cybersecurity products. And this is a massive quota if we think about Israel. And this is due to the fact that Israel has been able through the years to develop a quite unique, strategy which combines civilian knowledge and military knowledge, which is, of course, the result of a very militarized society, which is fully, engaged in a settler colonial project. So there is, in fact, here we come to Palestine, right? So the old debate about, Palestine as a lab is very much not only a question of being the lab, but in fact is a variable that allows Israel to have this position in terms of the leadership for cybersecurity. And when it comes to fragmentation of the internet, Israel is, of course, leading this kind of trend. There is investment fund for creating optic cables linking Europe to the Gulf and India, in which Israeli, have a lot of stakes in terms of investment. But also Israel is branding themselves as cyber capacity building actors all over the world. So these technical capabilities, commercial let's say, resources, are also, in fact, providing the country with the new legitimacy in terms of diplomatic relations. So in this context of fragmentation of the infrastructure, I think then the question we need to ask, not to fall into the trap of being a bit techno-optimistic, is where is Palestinian cyberspace in all of this? I think this is something that I would like to discuss maybe in the next round.
Yeah, for sure. And obviously, when we talk about Israel's influence on the cyber level, I mean, there are very famous cases of journalists around the world who basically have been tracked by other governments using Israeli products and methods of tracking. Certainly, we'll come around to the impact on Palestinian society specifically, but I want to also bring Sosan in real quick on kind of a little bit of your work, Sosan, working with Human Rights Watch on the threat of autonomous weapons, then the threats they pose, generally speaking, and then also specifically in a Palestinian context as well. If you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, of course. Well, thank you so much, Ahmad, for moderating this panel, and thank you to my incredible co-panelists, Muna and Fabio, for going before me. I would just like to say, so it's kind of, when I try to conceptualize, this, what are autonomous weapons, right? So when we try to sort of conceptualize of the spectrum of harm that comes from not just digital dehumanization, but can also result from the use of artificial intelligence and other emergent technologies, we have a spectrum that sort of, along the spectrum, we have, as Muna mentioned, right, this militarization of the use of invasive surveillance technologies. Then we also have, as Fabio pointed out, sort of this militarization of cyberspace, and even, this concept of the diminishing of cyberspace. But along the extreme end of the spectrum, we also have something called autonomous weapons or killer robots. And what we at Human Rights Watch sort of like to define these weapons as these are weapons that would rely on sensor processing rather than human input to select and engage targets. So essentially, these weapon systems are, once activated, can go out into the world and use sensors, whether that be facial recognition technology, biometric data, et cetera, to select and then use force against human targets, essentially reducing life and death decisions to machines. And this can be on the battlefield, this can be in policing, or this can be in efforts of border control. And what we like to think is like this is essentially the worst case scenario on the slide towards digital dehumanization, and it essentially challenges our very concepts of humanity. I'm going to talk a bit about some of the concerns that they raise, and then hopefully, and later on in the session, we can get into how that relates to surveillance. So first, obviously, there is a plethora of ethical concerns, reducing people to data points for the purpose of exerting force against them is something that should be prohibited, or that we can agree upon should be prohibited across the board. And because you end up coding such algorithms to target people and to seek out certain people, you have to have certain metrics, right? To say like, okay, anyone that walks a certain way, looks a certain way, has a certain build, has a certain skin color, is deemed a threat, correct? So then you end up running the risk of entrenching certain biases and discriminations into code, and whether this discrimination and biases are deliberate or incidental, I think doesn't really matter, and especially doesn't really matter when we think about when we think about it within the concept of Palestine, right? What does it mean to accidentally be discriminatory towards something when an entire system or an entire military apparatus is built upon such discrimination? And then you have certain concerns looking at it from the perspective of international law, right? There's the principles of distinction under international humanitarian law, which requires any human using force to distinguish between people that are actively participating in hostilities versus, say, civilians, injured combatants, medical personnel, etc. And as we know, and as we have seen, I think just recently within the past 2 or 3 years within Palestine, these distinctions are often very much contextual, and they also fluctuate on a case-by-case basis. And under international human rights law, there are also principles of sufficiency, necessity, and proportionality that dictates the rules of law. And whether these weapons can challenge or even abide by these sort of principles is a question to be explored. But also they raise the question of accountability concerns as well. So once you have a violation, say within the laws of war, that are carried out by essentially a machine, who do you hold accountable to that? Do you hold those who coded the machine? Do you hold those who sort of are employed the machine, or the coders that have made that machine or have made the algorithm? In this is, I guess, like it is a major concern. But I think apart from the legal concerns and also the ethical concerns surrounding all of this, there's also this idea that these weapon systems and the code and the algorithms that sustain these weapon systems require a plethora of data. And I think that this is one thing that we'll talk about later within the panel, but then also is one of the major points of concern is that they require a plethora of data, surveillance data, and data that is acquired invasively. So this would also encourage and enhance governments' ability and governments and organizations' ability to invasively surveil populations and to gather this data into a database that is then used to sort of create and deploy these weapon systems.
Thank you, Sosan. It does feel like we're heading towards a dystopian reality. You know, a lot of people watch Black Mirror and feel like that's an alternate universe in which things are really, really far-fetched. And honestly, looking at the trending of autonomous weapons the way they are heading, it is kind of deeply concerning, especially when we look at a Palestinian population under occupation that gets to have this meted out, basically, against them without any constraints. I want to circle back to Muna on the question of the way that the Palestinians struggle against this form of repression and how it connects to other people. Obviously, the Palestinian experience is unique because no other place is just like Palestine, but that doesn't mean that there aren't parallels elsewhere in the world. Can you talk a little bit about those connections between these struggles and how other people may be experiencing things that are similar that Palestinians can connect with as well?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Omar, for your question. So before start speaking about the intersection struggle, just to understand how is that connected with other people's struggle, I'm gonna give an example about Microsoft and AnyVision. A couple of years ago, Microsoft was going to invest over $75 million in AnyVision, and AnyVision is an Israeli company who was supposed to develop the facial recognition technique and test that on Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territory before Microsoft starts selling that worldwide to profit from testing that on Palestinians. So there was a huge campaign against Microsoft because they are violating the international human rights law as well as the human rights and business principles. It was led by our partners and allies in the US, especially Jewish Voices for Peace. After a huge campaign, Microsoft divested from this investment and they regret it. So this is just an intro just to think about the $75 million that were going to be invested in AnyVision, so they can multiply that several times when they are selling that worldwide. And to be clear, who is going to buy such a technology? Many of the oppressive regimes will definitely invest in that to silence their people, to shrink the spaces of freedom of expression and opinion, and to militarize and securitize people's spaces to prevent them from having their basic and fundamental rights, which is the rights to privacy, the rights to freedom of expression, the rights to gathering and assembly. And through our journey in struggling against and confronting surveillance technologies, we also have been educating ourselves about other people's struggle against them. And there's a nice example, or not very nice, like there's a horrible example from the UK. Around a decade ago, when the UK government was trying to or started to use surveillance technologies, basically CCTV cameras in the public areas and in their cities, they started with Birmingham, which is one of the biggest cities in the UK. And at that time, those like people in Birmingham was basically against the CCTV cameras because they believe that they are basically discriminating and labeling people of color there because like historically, like there's this stereotyping that people of color basically they were stereotyped that they are high crimes communities. That was one side, but it's not the only example. There are so many examples around the world. Even Amazon, when they started using the AI and artificial intelligence in their hiring process, the first round of CV selections basically excluded all women from the process and all, even white women and all black men or men of color. That's the main reason behind that was basically because the data that was used to train the machine learning basically was a white man data. So this machine learning just accepts white man data. They will reject anything from women or men of color. And when they tested that and checked that, they found that this was the problem. So this is just like one example from the UK, one example from Amazon, but that's again, like those are examples that were revealed and we are aware of, but there are so many embedded discriminatory examples in other companies and in other technologies that we are using on a daily basis. And basically they are used to discriminate against people of color, against Muslim communities, and against other minorities, sometimes also against women or LGBTQ communities. Therefore, we as Palestinians see this from a very intersectional lens when we are confronting surveillance technologies. When it comes to spywares and malwares, many of the Arab oppressive regimes are buying data from the Israeli government. I can give an example: the Saudi government, the UAE government, the Moroccan, the Saudi and the UAE regimes, the Moroccan regime, and among others. And they are basically using that to oppress their people and silence them, to prevent them from criticizing the governments and regimes in those countries. And just thinking about that, we can see how they are using that basically against political opponents, journalists, activists, human rights defenders, and more particularly when they are women, especially in such patriarchal communities where they are oppressing queers and women more than other people. That said, I would think that the intersectional struggle and the intersectional lens is much needed whenever we are talking about joint campaigns and even studies to think about how we can combat that together, because we as Palestinians, even if we are a unique case, we can't do anything with this uniqueness unless we are collaborating, joining our forces with other communities around the world, but also more particularly in the global south and our brothers and sisters in the Arab region. I'm not sure if you have any follow-ups, but like that's the overview on this topic. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you, Muna. And certainly it's honestly a reminder that people should be paying attention everywhere in the world on what's happening in Palestine, because in many ways it is a preview of the experiences that could be exported to them at any point. Sausan, I see a question in the chat, and I have a question of my own, so I'm just going to combine the two together and kind of give you a chance to give a two-part answer, if that's okay. One question is from Amber Rahman, who says, could you share examples of autonomous weapons used in Palestine? I've heard about smart shooters, for example, used at a checkpoint. Separately from that, you had closed your last question with talking about collecting data and surveillance. And I know that there is a new report that came out from Amnesty International talking about automated apartheid and how that basically entails very significant invasive surveillance. Can you talk about that as well and kind of how it connects to your work?
Yeah, of course. So like you mentioned, Ahmed, earlier this month, Amnesty International released a report titled Automated Apartheid, which essentially explores how facial recognition technology is used extensively by the Israeli authorities to support their continued oppression and apartheid of Palestinians in the occupied Palestinian territories. And this sort of goes into this concept of a frictionless occupation, right? Or some people like to call it a remote controlled occupation, where we're starting to see the emergence of a lot of these emerging technologies within being sort of experimentally used across the Palestinian territories in a way before they're exported out into the world, similar to what Fabio and Muna were talking about earlier in this concept of, or this analogy of a lab. What we see in this report is that they're expose the use of this facial recognition technology called Blue Wolf, which, you know, underneath Blue Wolf, there's also White Wolf, Blue Wolf, etc. And it's technology deployed by the Israelis at military checkpoints and through CCTV cameras all around Hebron. And what they do is essentially scan Palestinian faces and then add them to surveillance databases without their consent. And Israel's extensive use of this biometric recognition technology in Gaza and then the occupied Palestinian territories, I think it's important to note, and this is just touching back on Muna's first topic and for our first question, was that this is used to monitor and control essentially Palestinians' participation in public life, their access to services, and in border crossing. And not only does this sort of extend the capacity of Israel to discover people's identities without their knowledge and violating their civilians' rights to privacy, but it also infringes on the freedom of movement, assembly, association, and expression. And that, from there comes the more extensive sort of nuanced infringements. But this mass surveillance tool, such as the Red Wolf and such as what we see in the Automated Apartheid Report, serves as to intimidate and also to monitor all Palestinians, right? And this indiscriminate effect, I think, is what's one of the main findings of the report, but also sort of highlights the extent of the violations and of the human rights violations. But as the Amnesty report highlights, this escalation for the incorporation of AI technologies to sustain an Israeli military occupation raises also serious concerns about the use of AI and automation as a tool of state violence. And this is just going back to Amber's point. So like I mentioned earlier, autonomous weapon systems are an extension of this AI-powered surveillance tools. And I want to add a little quote here. Ray Etchison recently published a book called Abolishing State Violence. And they write in their book that once human beings are rendered into objects traceable through their identities prescribed by those conducting this kind of processing, categorizing, sorting, and surveillance, then it becomes easier to choose who should be subjected to harm. And this is exactly sort of what we see happening now. We see this extensive and vast, massive surveillance technologies employed across the Palestinian territories, which then begs the question of, okay, then what's next? What are we going to use this surveillance? What are we going to use this data collected for? And when we see this in Israel's development of drones, loitering munitions, etc. But what I want to focus on is also to point to Amber's question is a smart shooter, which is one of the recent examples of this trajectory towards fully autonomous weapons technologies. And while the smart shooter, which I'll get into in a bit, isn't technically a fully autonomous weapons, it does sort of highlight the trend and the trajectory of where we're going. And so in the late 2022, around September and October, the Israeli military installed an automated gun turret called the Smart Shooter at the Bab Zawiya checkpoint in Hebron. And this remote control gun turret, uses optical sensors and artificial intelligence to essentially track and lock in on its targets. But two things to keep in mind now is that the weapon system is, from what we understand, currently the weapon system requires a human in the loop to deploy its payload, meaning that once the weapon tracks a target, locks in on the target, a human operator, whether that be a soldier sitting in a tower or behind a desk, still clicks to approve whether to deploy the payload or not. And this is sort of what causes people to question, okay, well, is it a fully autonomous weapon if there is a human in the loop? And the second thing is that according to a military spokesperson that gave an interview or offered a quote to Hazaret's article, which was one of the first to publish this news, they said that the weapon is currently only used to confront people disrupting order in the area. And I put it in quotation marks, not just because it's a quote, because also sort of going back to what Muna was saying earlier about what does it mean to disrupt order, right? These concepts of people that are threats, that are disrupting order, when you're already operating within a system that sees essentially the entire captive Palestinian population as a threat, sort of has this, it becomes cloudy in a sense to say, okay, well, is a child that's standing below the checkpoint carrying a rock, is he a threat, right? And it goes back to this idea of what is proportionality and how can we ensure proportionality within these weapon systems. And that's just one example. Another example would be Elbit's Lanius drone system that is this entire motherboard of multiple drones that can be deployed that are used for complex urban environments and that can have the ability to autonomously map out and scope out buildings and also detect threat levels of targets. And we're not sure, but we know there's a video released on social media in February earlier this year of this sort of micro drones going into a home and then deploying their payload for one of the in Nablus when the Israeli military was going after some resistance fighters. And one thing that we kind of think is like, okay, this is being used now, but we're not really sure. There's a sense of opacity between the algorithms and also where the human is in these weapon systems, right? So it kind of just pegs the question of where what are the weapons that are being developed, and how far along are we to sort of reach this idea of a fully autonomous weapon system? And I think that this is going back to Omar, your point, also Muna's point earlier, is that it's really concerning, because I think that while a lot of people are focusing on places of active warfare, right, like Ukraine and the loitering munitions that were used by Russia and Ukraine, I think one thing that we should also be just as maybe even more focused on is places of sustained sort of protracted state violence, like Palestine, where we see the development of these weapons sort of just pop out, sort of, seemingly overnight. We have this gun turret installed into a checkpoint, and I think that sort of being away from the public eye for so long grants Israel some sort of, I guess, veil to deploy and use these weapons that are then exported around the world. So I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you, Sofsan. And it kind of points a little bit to the physical manifestations of the threats that Palestinians endure. But it's also, there's the added problem, Fabio, of the digital cyberspace being entirely dominated by Israel. Can you talk a little bit, you've kind of laid the big picture kind of Israel's role globally on the cybersecurity threat that is basically posed to people everywhere. But there is a unique Palestinian challenge under the infrastructure of occupation, both physical and digital. Can you talk a little bit more about that too?
Yes, thank you, Omar. Actually, yes, I want to exactly point at this kind of, let's say, uniqueness of the Palestinian case, perhaps also adding up on what has been just said. So as I was mentioning, in a global context of internet fragmentation, bordering of the internet. So it is very important to ask where the Palestinian space, cyberspace, is, and whether it can be understood only in terms of the information and the content that we see online. So simply put, of course, we can think about cyberspace as being made of information and infrastructure. And we have been discussing a lot today about content moderation and the importance that issues related to information have, both for surveillance and security, but also, as was said earlier by Nadim, about the economic perspectives for Palestinians. But I want to focus a bit on the infrastructure, on the internet infrastructure, because at the bottom of the information layers, of course, there is a physical layer. And I think this has been a bit overlooked in the analysis of Palestinian cyberspace, thus leading to very much cyber optimistic perspectives. And when we're talking about the physical layer, of course, we're talking about subsea cables, terrestrial networks, internet exchange points, antennas, and so on. And very simply, as was also said earlier, Israel is in full control of this infrastructure. And I think this is not only an issue of discrimination or of state violence as we see it elsewhere. Infrastructure control, like the control of the internet infrastructure, is very much school book colonialism. And I think it is important for us to add this analytical dimension if we want to understand the prospect for Palestinian freedoms online. And this is very much what sets Palestine apart from other cases, right? The impossibility of controlling the infrastructure. So 2 points here. One, infrastructural autonomy, which is going to be one of the main focus of this kind of, let's say, more constructive, let's say, suggestion that I have here. And when we talk about infrastructural autonomy and the lack of infrastructural autonomy, we are talking very much about the history of colonialism, right? It's one of infrastructural power. In 1995, the Oslo II framework explicitly set the Palestinian Authority right to nurture an independent ICT sector and an autonomous national infrastructures. This is very much being neglected until today because of the Israeli control on infrastructure, but it has also been a bit neglected in the debate about Palestinian cyberspace. So I want to draw attention to this question and the prospect of putting infrastructural autonomy back into the debate. Because at the end of the day, the question is, how can we enjoy freedoms online if we do not have control on the infrastructure? Is that even possible? I think this is a question that we really need to address. The second aspect is very much related to the cybercrime law, the Palestinian Authority cybercrime law, and the extent to which this has contributed to further depriving Palestinians of sovereignty online. So with Israel in full control of network infrastructure, the Palestinian Authority and the Hamas administration, of course, they retain limited sovereignty functions with regard to cyberspace. Yet these functions are expressed in very, let's say, controlling policies, such as the cybercrime law. And going back to the discussion that we had earlier about the tools that Palestinians can use to circumvent the block, the Tor project, which is a very interesting one. It is worth mentioning that the use of VPN and the like to circumvent internet blocks is illegal in Palestine because of the cybercrime law. So I think it is very important that while we discuss the issue of infrastructural autonomy, we also address the cybercrime law that has been amended, but still poses very important limitations to the possibility of enjoying a free internet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Fabio. And certainly we will move to kind of talking about the possibility of whether that kind of autonomy even is an option. Just flagging the fact that we have about 12 minutes left. And so to that effect, I'm going to mix some of the questions that we're getting into the chat as well, into the questions that I'm asking as well. So we do have Sam Shakir, who is asking, what are the tools available or could be available for Palestinians to resist the new methods of oppression? On that note, I guess we can start with Sausan. Just addressing that question and kind of what other information for the people who are watching can kind of make use of in creating that resistance that we need to the trend that we're witnessing.
Yeah, so I mean, like you mentioned earlier, Ahmed, it does feel like we're approaching into this sort of dystopian world. But I don't like to think about that too much, because then we want to get pretty much anything done. But what I do like to think is we have incredible Palestinian organizations such as Shabaka, and Hamla, even organizing such panels such as the PDAF every year that are working to actively resist aspects of digital dehumanization and automated violence. And I think that we sort of can use that as an example, but then also build on that and sort of build on that, this organized effort, and try to have a more concerted, sort of concentrated effort from Palestinians and international activists to better advocate against this normalization and abstraction of violence, and in turn the threat of autonomous weapon systems. And not just within sort of at a national level, but I think also within spaces of international diplomacy as well. Currently talks of a treaty to limit or to ban the use or the development of fully autonomous weapon systems is now entering its 10th year of negotiations with no avail within the UN system. So I think that, it's kind of disheartening in a way, but then also, and especially disheartening when you think about how technologies are being developed and at such a pace that sort of outpaces these diplomatic talks. But I think it's also encouraging to think that, just look into how past disarmament treaties have come about, right? We have seen the commitment in the fruits of the efforts of a small and committed group of dedicated countries and individuals and organizations that can influence global behaviors and how weapons are developed and used, and even how wars are fought. And I just think back to, landmines were a common, weapon used in war for decades. And then now we have a treaty banning them with more than 160 countries signed on. So I think that we can have similar efforts and similar sort of push within the space of automated harm and not fully autonomous weapons. So I think that that's one thing that we could be doing. And I'm not sure if that answers your question, but it's encouraging for me.
For sure. I think, the only option that we have in the face of such a dark reality is any signs of hope and any possible things that people can plug into to move forward. I think is we don't have any other option. What is the alternative? I think we have to kind of hang on that level of optimism and try to move forward with it in any way that we can. Fabio, I feel like for you, it's a little bit more challenging. You mentioned a little bit about the prospect of Palestinian independence digitally from Israel. Is that even physically possible given the conditions on the ground? What does that even mean or look like, the possibility of Palestinians to try to gain digital independence from Israel's dominance and control?
Yes, no, that's a very good and challenging question. And I feel I've been very bringing here a very pessimistic perspective of on what is possible and what is not possible. I think it's important to see other ways in which we can relate to this kind of overwhelming and ubiquitous surveillance. Elsewhere, you will see that there is a big movement for the disengagement, especially those cyber utopians that I mentioned earlier, the hacktivist communities from the 90s. They are actually advocating for the disconnect, right? So the idea that there is not the possibility of enjoying freedoms online. And of course, we have to understand this is very much a Western bias and comes with the privilege of being connected. So going back to Palestine, I think if I can make a road map in my understanding of the problem here, I think it's important to first put infrastructural autonomy back on the agenda and to understand that there is not any exceptionalism about cyberspace. This is an infrastructure that actually is, let's say, responding to the same logic of colonial control. So only by putting those into question, we can actually think about a free Palestinian cyberspace. Tools like Tor project or others, I think, are very good. And we, of course, need to be a bit aware of the, let's say, technological divide that we mentioned at the beginning, right? Who is able to use this tool and who is left out. But also, this also brings a question, which perhaps we don't have the time to discuss now, of to what extent using these tools to circumvent the status quo of the Israeli full control on Palestinian cyberspace indicates some sort of normalization of the status quo. I think this is an issue that we need to address. Concluding, I think it's also important to put into question the cybersecurity cooperation that the Palestinian Authority has with Israelis. I think without putting that into question, it is very unlikely to, let's say, to create the prospects for a better digital experience for Palestinians. And also, finally, to engage more openly internationally, as also was said before, and I'm particularly thinking about the UN Open-Ended Working Group on Cybersecurity, where Israel has been very vocal lately, and this is very important to follow this debate and to challenge eventually what is being decided there.
Fabio, do you mind we were talking before this panel about the way that sometimes things like VPNs could potentially make you more vulnerable. Do you just want to touch base on that very quick, like in under a minute, kind of explaining the dangers of sometimes thinking you have ways around Israeli control when you don't?
Yes, no, that's a very good point. I forgot to mention. I think we of course, we have discussed that there is Israelis in full control of the infrastructure, right? So by banning VPN, so with the Palestinian Authority banning VPN, what the result is that Palestinian traffic is sent back to the Israeli infrastructure, right? So I think this is the issue there when it comes to the bans. And also, again, there is a technological divide, right? So there is knowledge required for accessing these tools of about privacy, anonymity, and knowledge about this is not available to the large population, which creates a discrimination within society in its own terms. Mm-hmm. So it is important to think about these tools not as a way of normalizing and circumventing the status quo, but we should perhaps be a bit more ambitious and think about the broader picture and infrastructural autonomy. A very good question.
Yep. Thank you. Certainly very important information for all of us to keep in mind. With 5 minutes left, I have one final question for Muna. Muna, I want you to take us home with kind of you're living, you know what the sense on the ground is, the spirit of resistance that Palestinians display day in and day out. Can you talk about what the mood is in Palestine a little bit right now and kind of how we build on that, how we build allyship across the world to combat the occupation more broadly and digital oppression more specifically as well?
Yes, of course. So if we just want to look at the dark side, then we would quit our jobs, leave everything, and just like that's a dark reality that we are living under. But fortunately, people are hopeful. People are thinking how they are confronting militarization and securitization for their spaces, whether it's online or offline all the time. And that's pretty much like the spirit is confronting such oppressive technologies. And if we have this spirit, then we won't be at any time beaten, because we're still thinking how we can confront that. Palestinians for a very long time have been censored on social media platforms. Many of our content has been taken down, but for fun. It's not for fun, for just like, yeah, for fun. Sometimes they are like thinking about in new ways, they're exploring in new ways on how they can keep their content online. They sometimes even don't use like the flag of Palestine, they use watermelon to point out that this content is coming out of Palestine. This is how they are trying to think about keeping their content online when they want to talk about something in Palestine. But when it comes to the digital surveillance or the surveillance in our urban places, it's a bit more complicated, because whenever there's facial recognition, or whenever you are just passing through a military checkpoint and you are forced to be photographed, or your data should be profiled in the blue wolf or the red wolf or the white wolf, it's way more complicated, because if you said no, you would be definitely arrested and you will be profiled there. So you will be profiled here or there. And they have this sense of competition on who gonna file more Palestinians during their military shift, when they are on their shift on the military checkpoint. But again, Palestinians are usually thinking about in new ways how they are confronting that. And also Palestinians are now more thinking more strategically on how they are building allies and partnerships, as well as coalitions around the world, to pressure companies to end their investments, or to end their complicity in such technologies that is basically used to oppress Palestinians and to shrink our spaces. So I've spoke before about Any Vision as one of the campaigns, but now like there is an ongoing campaign against Google and Amazon for their Nimbus project, which is basically a huge contract with the military occupation. I haven't had the chance to speak about that, but it's an ongoing project and they are investing billions of dollars in this project. But again, as Palestinians, we are trying to lobby more, to do more advocacy efforts to document that, because in many cases, like the surveillance technology in Hebron, the surveillance technologies used in Hebron are not basically, like, you can't find a research that is basically profiling or documenting all the surveillance technologies that is used in Hebron. Because if you can just document that and look in depth into that, you would understand how terrible the situation there is. And Hebron is just like one of them. And again, they are calling that a smart city, but it's not. That's just an automated occupation or automated colonialism. So again, that's why we need to think how we can join the forces with other people, with other oppressed communities, how we can also build allies and influence other people, so they can also pressure their governments to put more pressure on Israel to stop doing or to stop developing and testing their surveillance technologies on Palestinians. So the way is too long, but at least we started and we're going to continue. That's the spirit. And yeah, that's it from my end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mina. That was very, very well said. And to the question from Nick in the chat asking if he heard correctly that the PA had banned VPNs, just confirming that you did hear that correctly. Unfortunately, the challenges facing Palestinians under occupation are many, many layers. Thank you very much for the entire panel, for Monastaya, for Sausan Abu Eid, and for Dr. Fabio Cristiano for a very, very insightful conversation. We have a lot of challenges ahead of us, but obviously the spirit of resistance for Palestinians continues. And, you know, they need all the allies that they can around the world. So we have people can plug into this as well. And thank you to Hamle for hosting this panel.